If you've been paying attention to European politics, you'll notice that every single election for basically every single country is centered around one thing: immigration.
Europe will be overwhelmed by migration.
Migration is resurging as a key political battleground.
It's the most important issue by far facing Europe as a whole, with sometimes whole election debates being centered purely around it, ignoring everything else. As a result of this, we've seen a massive surge of right-wing populist parties winning elections everywhere. And it's all on the same exact stance: we will stop immigration. If we want to map out the surges, I'd sum it up like this. In Italy, we saw the election of Giorgia Meloni and her party, the Brothers of Italy, come to power. In the Netherlands, the Party for Freedom, or PVV for short, founded by the infamous Geert Wilders, won a staggering 37 out of 150 seats in parliament, more than double the party secured in the last election. It's now easily the largest party in the Netherlands. In Sweden, the Sweden Democrats came second in their election, but are now ruled by a centre-right coalition. In Austria, the current Freedom Party was founded by former Nazi functionaries and SS officers in 1949, when former Nazis regained their right to vote. It was known as the Federation of Independents at the time, representing the interests of former members of the Nazi Party. It's currently polling at 30% support at the time of this video, comfortably higher than any other party, and expected to win control of the government come next election. In Finland, we saw the far-right Finn Party come second in their elections. It's really the same story in most EU countries, even if they're not currently in power. Vox has had a rapid rise in Spain. In Portugal, the far-right Chega Party quadrupled its parliamentary representation from 12 seats to 50. And in France, even though Macron was able to hold off Le Pen and her National Party in the 2022 presidential elections, it's almost guaranteed that this will not be the case in the next one. And it's the same with Germany, with the German far-right party, the Alternative for Germany, or AfD, polling at 20% nationwide, only behind the CDU-CSU political conservative alliance at 30%, which means that Germany most likely will be swinging to the right for sure come next election. Even Denmark, run currently by the centre-left, has a very right-wing immigration stance. I'd also argue that Brexit was more about taking back immigration control from the EU than anything else, as we saw from the immigration-fueled rise of the UK Independence Party. Really, I can go on about this for every country in the EU. But you know what the craziest thing is? A lot of these parties, such as the AfD or PVV, were for years seen as far-right organizations that were on the fringes of society. No one wanted to associate with them, and they almost never got many seats in parliament, if any at all. But now that's all changed, and it's mainly because of mass immigration, the refugee crisis, whatever you want to call it, being combined with straining public services and housing shortages. If we want to pinpoint where this issue really got bad, I'd say it was from the beginning of the Arab Spring, a collective political uprising in the Arab world, including several nations in MENA, the North Africa Middle East region. Throughout the early 2010s, anti-government protests and rebellions spread across the Maghreb in particular, a variety of prominent issues including corruption, poverty, separatist violence, human rights violations by authoritarians and monarchs, and much more had combined into this region-wide movement of citizens seeking democracy, civil rights, and societal reforms. The response from pro-government factions and militaries was violent and led to a series of high-profile conflicts. So, in the same way that poverty leads to violence, oppression leads to radicalization. Civil wars came to pass in Yemen, Libya, Syria, Iraq, in addition to numerous insurgencies, including in Egypt. The rise of terror groups in Iraq, nearly a decade after the US invasion there, was a sign of how political extremism and violent cells were exacerbated by the foreign intervention. The unrest and instability across Iraq gave these groups in general an alluring quality for many locals whose lives were destroyed by US attacks. This provoked the US and their allies to intervene again, this time in the name of eradicating them. These interventions have fed into the cycle of violence across the region. When it comes to the Arab Spring, the power vacuums formed in the wake of it encouraged foreign powers to seek influence in the new political landscape of North Africa and the Middle East. In the case of the 2015 Syrian civil war, this occurred between Russia and the US. The Gulf states and NATO backed anti-government rebels to take down the Assad dictatorship. Meanwhile, Russia and Iran helped back pro-Assad forces to counter the West's efforts. These foreign influences created a proxy conflict that is still devastating a large portion of the Levant. A similar scenario played out in Libya with Gaddafi too. In both Syria and Libya, the US claimed to be supporting democracy and protecting citizens. But of course, its actions revealed otherwise. In Syria alone, roughly 6.6 million people were forced to flee their country due to the war. It's said that almost 3 million people left their home across the MENA just in 2011. During this period, the EU announced that there was a 90% increase in asylum applications from Tunisian nationals and a 76% increase from Libyan nationals. Now, all of this is what we see. It's the surface of Europe's modern immigration problem. But the reality is it goes much deeper. I mean, why was the MENA region the way that it was that allowed it to erupt like this? We need to look at the root causes that's continuing to happen with no end in sight. After all, if Europe truly wants to decrease immigration, they must realize that even amazing border policies will eventually collapse if you fail to address the core problems that keep bringing more and more people exponentially every year. So what exactly is the problem? Well, I'd first like to say that this isn't some grand conspiracy theory, this isn't some evil plan orchestrated to destroy Europe, but rather it's the combination of a lot of issues. To understand these root causes and why they are nearly impossible to completely resolve, we must first analyze them on an individual basis and then discuss how they all tie together. But before that, I think it's important to understand the motive behind immigration.
Tense protests, street brawls, even arson attacks. So what does this mean for the thousands of refugees now caught up in a personal purgatory?
In simplest terms, it's about creating a better life for yourself and your family, because your country is in a crisis of poverty or in some type of civil war. Sometimes both. Because when you think about it at its core, why would someone want to immigrate from, for example, Syria to Germany if they didn't have to? I mean, it's a long, dangerous journey from home. They'll have to learn a completely new language different to their own. They'll most likely have to leave their entire family behind, go to a place with a completely new culture and religion, all while possibly being looked down upon for not being, quote, true German. I mean, if Damascus was as amazing as Berlin, there's no way that these people would leave. But that begs the question, why isn't a city like Damascus as good as Berlin, or Paris, London, or even Athens, which recently has had a huge far-right surge too? While much of the current waves of the immigration or refugee crisis stem from the Arab Spring in the early 2010s, we have to look much further back than that to understand absolutely everything, starting from colonialism. It's perhaps something many people are tired of hearing about endlessly, but it's a very real factor that's had long-lasting consequences. Almost all of Africa was colonized by the European powers of the UK, France, Germany, Belgium, and Portugal for the most part. Tens of millions of Africans died as a result of it, directly or indirectly. But more than that, trillions of dollars worth of resources were stolen, billions of hours worth of labor were exploited, and they never got a chance to develop or gain their own wealth because of that, obviously. They weren't able to industrialize, because how could they? Trade was also prohibited between Africans, so they were forced to export all cash crops produced and minerals mined, which meant that it created a reliance on imported goods from Europe, and they became cash crop economies. For centuries, Africa was just pillaged, and before that, there were similar Arab colonizations, so they never really got a chance to forge their own path. The Middle East also got colonized, of course. I mean, if we're going to talk about immigration and the refugee crisis to Europe, we need to look at both regions and why they're both unsolvable. Much of the same things happened to them as happened in Africa, but the countries also got carved up in a way that's caused never-ending consequences, such as the Palestine-Israel situation, or the Sykes-Picot Agreement between the UK and France following World War I, in how to carve up the Ottoman Empire, where we saw the creation of the state of Iraq, which has had long-lasting consequences for the Kurdish populations throughout Mesopotamia, who were left without a legitimate homeland, causing ethnic tensions that persist even today. The four-letter militant group that starts with IS, that you all know and I can't say on YouTube, has claimed one of the goals of its insurgency was to reverse the effects of the agreement, for instance. These sometimes violent creations of protectorates is thought to have been a part of the larger strategy of ensuring tension in the Middle East, thus necessitating the role of Western colonial powers. It's hard to visualize the scale at which this happened. I mean, it seems like just numbers on a screen, but it was huge. We're talking a multi-century, not only pause on development, but reversal. Of course though, colonization ended decades ago, with most countries gaining their independence by the 1970s, which would mean some 50 years ago now. So now the question always asked is, if colonization ended decades ago, why is Africa still so ruined? But that's the thing, colonization didn't actually end decades ago. It just evolved into what is now known as neo-colonialism. Let me explain.
Thousands of people in Nigeria's Niger Delta region are suing the oil giant Shell over alleged damage to their communities.
While before we saw actual countries establishing control over foreign territories and exploiting them, we now see it not done by the countries themselves, but rather the biggest corporations within them. Take, for example, the relationship between Shell, a British multinational oil and gas company, and the country of Nigeria, one of the richest natural resource countries in Africa, if not the richest. It started in 1956, when Shell discovered oil fields in the Niger Delta and told the Nigerian government that they'd develop their country and create loads of jobs and foreign investments if they're given permission to build the oil extraction infrastructure. Now, this seemed like a fair deal, as Nigeria was a poor, colonized country, and it was all but confirmed they were going to be gaining independence from the UK as early as 1954. So naturally, they welcomed the investments, because it meant more jobs, more infrastructure, more tax, and therefore more prosperity. The problem with this, though, is that even though all the infrastructure was in Nigeria, it was Shell who owned and operated it. This meant that in later years, Nigeria was dependent on Shell for keeping about 1,000 Nigerian oil wells running, and with 95% of Nigeria's exports being oil, that makes up for 40% of their total economy. They basically had control of almost half of Nigeria's total cash flow. Obviously, Nigeria made this deal themselves, but the problem was that it was the one they could never break free from. See, if Nigeria tried renegotiating the deal or nationalizing their resources, then Shell could simply halt extractions and decimate their economy. Shell also has connections to both the Dutch and royal families, as well as major banks, so they could influence them to pull out investments from the country if they tried anything. Shell controls the distribution network for the oil too, so even if by some miracle Nigeria managed to gain control of the extraction process, they would still need Shell to export it out of the country. Then there's the bribery aspect that comes into play. In 2011, Shell, in collaboration with Italian multinational oil company Eni, secured OPL 245, a valuable oil field off the coast of Nigeria, for just $1.3 billion. And allegations surfaced that $1.1 billion of it was used to bribe government officials, sparking a legal battle that spanned more than a decade. There's email proof that Shell executives knew where their money was going, but the European courts of course acquitted them anyway, which wasn't much of a surprise. Oftentimes, these companies control the courts too, as we've seen with Chevron against Ecuador, but that's a whole separate story. Nigeria lost $6 billion from this oil field deal alone, while Shell of course made record profits. For Nigerians, instead of being able to utilize this wealth, they instead were hit with a never-ending stream of oil spills. Starting from 2010, over 3,000 spills have been recorded and attributed to Shell, with at least 30 million liters getting drained into Nigeria. These oil spills of course contaminate the country's water supply and kill the economies that were based on farming and fishing, which of course ends up destroying people's lives in the end. If you want to protest against this, that's too bad, as Shell utilizes crazy propaganda such as saying 98% of the oil spills were due to vandalism, theft, or sabotage, instead of because of them. They also do heavy greenwashing to make it look like they're improving the country, but one man got close to hurting Shell, Ken Saro-Wiwa, then president of the Movement for the Survival of the Ogoni People. He only ever held non-violent protests, but after a few years of this, Shell got tired of him getting attention, and rather than getting a bad image by handling him themselves, they allegedly bribed the Nigerian military to do their dirty work. Him, along with 8 other leading activists of his movement, were arrested for the murder of 4 Ogoni chiefs, murders that happened on the day they were denied entry into Ogaliland. Of course, this meant nothing though, and they were all sentenced to death and hung. Many of these supposed witnesses in this case later admitted that they had been bribed by the Nigerian government to support the criminal allegations. At least 2 witnesses who testified that Saro-Wiwa was involved in the murders of the Ogoni elders later recanted, stating that they had been bribed with money and offers of jobs with Shell to give false testimony, in the presence of Shell's lawyer. Everyone knew Shell did it, but in the end, they settled for just $15.5 million. This is all recent too. It's not some issue that happened decades ago. It's still going on today. The largest trial in Swedish history started in late 2023, regarding Swedish multinational company Lundin Oil's chairman, Ian Lundin, and former CEO Alex Schneiter, for their involvement in supporting the Sudanese government of former dictator Omar al-Bashir, and then using their military as security at the site of one of Lundin Oil's exploration fields, which later led to aerial bombings, the killing of 12,000 civilians and burning of entire villages, leading to over 160,000 people being displaced. all to protect London Oil's operations. Surprisingly, or should I say not surprisingly, this is only the first time in history that the leadership of a multinational company is put on trial in a European country to answer charges of alleged complicity of war crimes in the conduct of their business activities. It's not just them who did it though. It was a consortium which involved Austria's multinational OMV Group and Malaysia's Petronas company. This isn't just limited to former colonial powers. As we see China get involved with their Belt and Road Initiative, and Russia beginning to intervene both militarily and politically in some countries with their Wagner Group, things may even get worse too. If you've heard about the largest tech companies in the world exploiting the Democratic Republic of Congo for their cobalt mines, it's the same thing. Then there's Ghana, which is among the largest exporters of gold in the entire world. And yet, according to a study by the Bank of Ghana, they own only 1.7% of it, with an insane 98.3% locked up by multinational corporations. In other words, of the $5.2 billion in gold produced from 1990 to 2002, the country only received $87.3 million in corporate income taxes and royalty payments. But that's the other thing, taxes. Multinational corporations use their enormous wealth to hide their money or change tax laws to protect it. Again, because they own these countries, costing developing nations between $20 and $40 billion annually. It's estimated that the Global South has lost $152 trillion in total through unequal exchange since 1960, around the time colonialism started to end. This isn't limited to one company in one country in one continent after one resource. It is dozens of multinational corporations going after every single resource in every single third world country. Now, at this point, you may be thinking about the simple solution of just saying no to these corporations. And if Africa didn't have corrupt leaders, then they wouldn't accept these bribes. And you're right, many of these African leaders are insanely corrupt and are stopping their country's progress. But the only problem is, they don't really have a choice for the most part. Any good leader who actually wants to fix their country will immediately be either killed or couped before they can jeopardize any profitable deals that these corporations maintain. This time we can look at Iran to show this, and as we now see today, Iran is one of the main enemies of the West, playing proxy warfare against them. But it wasn't supposed to be like this. Although Iran wasn't officially a colony or protectorate, it was still heavily controlled by foreign powers, beginning with concessions provided by the Qajar Shahs, and leading up to the oil agreement signed by Reza Shah in 1933 with the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, or AIOC for short. In the agreement, they promised to give laborers better pay, more chances for advancement, build schools, hospitals, roads, and a telephone system for a majority share of the oil. Of course, this never happened though, and naturally the Iranian public became discontent with the company, wanting to nationalize it to receive a better share than just 17.5% of the profits. So when the democratically elected Mohammad Mossadegh was elected as prime minister, that's what he set out to do. He was a good leader. Unemployment compensation was introduced, factory owners were ordered to pay benefits to sick and injured workers, and peasants were freed from forced labor in their landlords' estates. But trying to free his country from a multinational corporation was his ultimate undoing. Upon nationalizing the AIOC, the British government announced a de facto blockade and embargo in the Persian Gulf. Not only that, the British government also instigated a worldwide boycott of Iranian oil, threatening legal action against any purchases of oil produced in the Iranian refineries, and obtaining an agreement with its sister international oil companies to not fill in where the AIOC was boycotting Iran. As a result, the entire Iranian oil industry came to a virtual standstill. Oil production dropped almost 96% from 664,000 barrels in 1950 to 27,000 barrels in 1952. This reduced Iran's oil income to almost nothing, putting a severe strain on the implementation of Mossadegh's promised domestic reforms. This is exactly the same scenario I was referring to when talking about what happens if Nigeria was to try to break free from Shell's control. So Iranians were becoming poorer and unhappier by the day, which helped the British and US instigate a coup in 1953, overthrowing him. Just a year later, oil was flowing out of Iran. And no, it wasn't owned by them, but rather a consortium of AIOC, which had now changed its name to British Petroleum, along with American and other European multinational groups. They agreed to share profits on a 50-50 basis with Iran, but not to open its books to Iranian auditors or to allow Iranians onto its board of directors, which allowed them to divert and hide profits with ease, effectively controlling Iran's share of the profits. For just a brief period of modern history, Iran had a government acting on behalf of their people, and as the American former Secretary of State Dean Acheson concluded, the British were destructive and determined on a rule or ruin policy in Iran. I could go on with countless more examples, but you get the gist. So it doesn't matter if Africa or the Middle East has a good leader. because they'll just be dealt with for opposing their old colonial powers. We've seen this with Patrice Lumumba of the Democratic Republic of Congo at the hands of Belgium and the CIA, Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana at the hands of the CIA, a man voted African Man of the Millennium, but also according to intelligence documents released by the US Department of State, a man doing more to undermine US interests than any other African, because you can't be doing good for Africa and the US at the same time. There was also Amilcar Cabral of Guinea-Bissau, assassinated at the hands of someone believed to have been working with Portuguese agents, as well as perhaps the most famous example, Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso. Now, Sankara's case is still shrouded in mystery if French agents were involved, but what we do know is that within 3 years of his rule, despite Burkina Faso being a virtual backwater of a country with limited natural resources and a bare minimum of agriculture lands, the country became virtually self-sufficient, and even producing twice the amount of resources and food it needed to survive with almost no detrimental corruption. He also rejected loans and capital from organizations such as the International Monetary Fund and World Bank. But he was eventually killed in a coup, and the man that took over, Blaise Compaoré, had pro-France beliefs and immediately reversed the nationalizations, overturned nearly all of Sankara's policies, and rejoined the International Monetary Fund and World Bank. So make of that what you will. Now, this isn't to say all Europe's companies or governments only are doing this. It's really more a West versus the rest type of thing. But European multinational companies do this a lot, and given Europe's the closest stable continent, I guess I'd say it's obvious they'd flee to there. I'm only just painting the picture that colonialism is very much still alive, just evolved. Now, at this point you may be thinking, what about all the billions of aid that we donate to Africa though? Well, guys, the aid isn't actually doing anything. In 2012, the last year of recorded data, developing countries received a total of $1.3 trillion, including all aid, investment, and income from abroad. But that same year, some $3.3 trillion flowed out of them. While I unfortunately don't have more recent data than 2012, I'd imagine it's pretty similar, if not worse, as global inequality has risen. It's even arguable that aid is hurting Africa too. Let me explain. Imagine being a farmer in Africa. You produce enough food to feed your family, then you try to sell the rest at a market, right? Well, you can't, because aid workers are giving food away for free. It just inadvertently destroys local businesses, so there's no real economy to speak of. Don't get me wrong, not all aid is bad, but a lot of it unfortunately is. Now, unfortunately, there's still a lot more reasons for Europe to be dealing with this immigration crisis. And now we get to look at how it will get even worse, with eventually 10 times more, 20 times more, even 100 times more refugees coming over the years. See, another problem with these multinational corporations is they're careless, as we've seen with Shell in Nigeria. And because of this, these companies are heavily exacerbating CO2 emissions and climate change, essentially making many countries unlivable. When you do that, naturally citizens flee, creating what's known as climate refugees. Over the next 30 years, 143 million people are likely to be uprooted by rising seas, drought, soaring temperatures, and other climate catastrophes, according to the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report published in 2022. While most climate refugees just move to a different part of their country, inevitably, with time, this won't be enough. And since most of their neighboring countries are victims of similar issues, eventually the global north will be the place to go. So far, everything we've talked about is only the foreign exploitation side to the refugee problem. What's happening inside each European country is the other. Let me explain. Regardless of what you want to believe or who you vote for, nothing will actually change the reality that Europe, and really the entire West too, needs a ton of foreign workers to do extremely low-wage jobs that natives don't want to work. In the UK, more immigrants came through under the Tories after Brexit than before. In Italy, although Meloni has a tough stance on immigration, she increased quotas for work visas for non-EU citizens to 452,000 for the period of 2023 to 2025, a jump of nearly 150% from the previous 3 years. In 2023 alone, the 136,000 given out was the highest since 2008. In Germany, regardless of what the AfD says, they need 400,000 workers per year to account for its aging workforce. This all, of course, has to do directly with Europe's fertility crisis, where basically every country is dealing with decreasing birth rates. But as there's no end in sight for that, these worker shortages will only become more and more real. The other side to this is the reality that for a lot of rich businesses in Europe, and again, I'm really referencing the West as a whole now, is that they want tons of immigrations. They want to be able to pay extremely low wages and exploit their workers. It drives up their profit margins. So why should they care about demographic change? More immigration will give them more people to exploit, as they burn out the ones they're currently using. Unfortunately, this is the mentality for many of them. But as much as we can blame foreign countries and companies for this problem, there's also the undeniable reality of geography at play here, particularly in the Sahel. If we look at the Sahel and the Sahara more generally, the desert climate means consistent lack of rainfall and droughts. Niger, for example, is the largest country in West Africa and one of the poorest countries on Earth. A big reason for this is that 80% of its land falls within the Sahara. The majority of the population relies on self-sustenance agrarian lifestyles, making chronic malnutrition and food shortages a serious issue. Only 56% of the country has access to a clean source of drinking water. This combination of food insecurity, water insecurity, and the reduced economic growth prospects caused by climate disasters end up increasing poverty rates. It's something that rarely affects a lot of the global south, where people are located in much hotter climates, whether that be somewhere in India or Qatar. In fact, if you look at the projected ratio of water demand to water availability by 2050, the MENA region is at extremely high risk. Take Syria before the Arab Spring, for example. Desertification of formerly fertile land between 2006 and 2010 destroyed crop yields. This left 800,000 farmers without income. Almost 90% of the country's livestock died. Food prices then skyrocketed due to the shortage, and over 1.5 million people moved from rural areas to cities to find work. Those who stayed in the destitute and barren lands were easy targets for the violent groups to recruit as they rolled through. The Syrian government and their repressive regime was most at fault for the beginning of the Arab Spring. But there is a domino effect of some kind linking these various factors to mass displacement and the eventual migrant crisis in Europe. And as I said before, when an already disastrous climate situation is worsened due to corporations, the already insufficient areas that provide access to water and irrigation, allowing farmers to grow crops, become even less efficient. This can push regions that are on the brink of a food security or water security crisis into complete disaster mode. This is not to say that corporations established in these countries are inherently predatory, but their greed certainly doesn't help. And all of this isn't to say the blame totally lies in the West. I mean, a lot of it does if we're being brutally honest, but it's impossible to absolve these MENA countries from any blame completely. They're still being dominated by some tribal and ethnic tensions that came about from themselves, which foster violence and corruption. A lot of the violations of human rights stems from these things, which don't have anything to do with the West. And like I said earlier, we can't excuse China and Russia from any blame now either, especially as they're beginning to take a bigger part in this. If you've gotten this far into the video, you may be wondering what the solution to this really is, or if I have opinions on any, and unfortunately I don't. Once a country totally collapses, it's very hard to fix. Eastern European countries like Hungary cooperating with the EU and taking more refugees won't actually change anything. Maybe it will lighten the burden on other countries, but it's all just a band-aid for the root causes we talked about before. Until that gets fixed, nothing will change. But the thing is, it never will. Like I said, it doesn't matter who you vote for, as corporations run the countries. They may have less power in Europe than, say, America, but their influence is immeasurable. There's also the reality of why life is so good in the West in the first place. If we go into economic theory a bit, can a first world country exist without a third world to exploit from? Sure, a country like Denmark isn't exploiting the world at the scale the US is, or even at all, but they benefit from it all the same. The problem is that if the West was to truly, and I mean truly, leave the third world alone to develop, or in their timeline never did what they did, then their quality of life would be significantly lower. There'd be way less immigrants or refugees for sure, yes, but everything would be way more expensive, as countries can set fair prices without fear of being overthrown. Life would undoubtedly not be as fruitful as we enjoy today. Would that be worth it though? You tell me. I'm not here advocating for a communist revolution or anything, don't get me wrong, but the insanely unequal distribution of resources, especially away from the regions rich in them, is a huge factor in this. How Europe reacts to this will be interesting. While over time the continent becomes increasingly right-wing and more climate refugees come over, what the end result is something I'm very curious about. In the end, this isn't a hit piece against Europe. It's rather something we have to be truly honest about if we want to address the problem, instead of trying to spend billions of dollars ultimately leading to no change. Am I missing something though? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching.